Iran spent 40 years building a trap. America just walked through it, locked the door behind them, and handed Iran the key to a room with no exits. That is not a metaphor. That is the precise operational description of what has happened in the Strait of Hormuz over the past 72 hours. And if you understand what the United States military has actually done in that 21-mile stretch of water, not what the headlines are saying, not what the diplomatic statements are claiming, but what has physically, operationally, and permanently changed in the geometry of that waterway, then you will understand why the word powerless is not dramatic language. It is a technical assessment. Iran is powerless in the Strait of Hormuz right now, not weakened, not degraded, not operating at reduced capacity, powerless. The specific capability that made Iran a credible threat to global energy markets for 4 decades, the capability to close the strait or make its transit so costly that the global economy would pressure Washington into accommodating Tehran's demands, that capability no longer exists in a functional form. And the process through which it was removed was so systematic, so precisely sequenced, and so thoroughly executed that the Iranian military commanders who spent their careers building the architecture that was supposed to prevent exactly this outcome are sitting in their bunkers right now looking at assessment reports that they do not have the institutional vocabulary to process. Because the vocabulary for describing total strategic defeat in the domain your entire doctrine was built around does not exist in the IRGC's operational lexicon. They built the architecture to win. They did not build a framework for understanding what losing looks like when the losing is this complete. To understand how complete the losing is, you have to start where Iran's power in the strait actually lived, not in the abstract. In the specific physical and operational elements that made the threat real and made global energy markets price it seriously for 4 decades. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through those 21 miles, 20% of the world's daily oil supply moves every single day. The physical geography is the foundation of everything. A narrow channel with high terrain on the Iranian side. Coastal geography that provides natural concealment for fast attack boats, radar arrays, missile batteries, and drone launch sites. Island geography, particularly Keshem Island and Abu Musa, that extends Iran's operational reach into the middle of the channel rather than just along its northern shore. The geography itself was Iran's first weapon. It required no maintenance budget, no trained operators, no logistics chain. It simply existed in a configuration that any military strategist looking at a map would immediately recognize as naturally favorable to a coastal power attempting to control transit. Iran's military investment over 40 years was the systematic exploitation of that geography, building into it, hardening within it, integrating weapon systems across it in a network whose collective effect was designed to be greater than the sum of its individual components. You take out one battery, 2 more have the same target covered. You suppress one radar array, the targeting data routes through a different node. You sink one fast attack boat squadron, 3 more emerge from different coastal positions. The redundancy was the architecture, the depth was the strategy, and the cost imposition on any adversary attempting to contest the strait was designed to be cumulative, continuous, and ultimately politically unsustainable. For 40 years, this architecture worked. Not because it defeated American military power in direct engagement. It never did that. It worked because it did not have to defeat American military power. It only had to make the cost of contesting Iran's leverage high enough that American political will to pay that cost indefinitely would eventually be exceeded by the economic and diplomatic pressure from a global community that needed the oil moving through the strait to keep moving. The architecture was not a military victory strategy. It was a political exhaustion strategy implemented through military means. America understood this strategy completely. American naval planners have been gaming it in war simulations for 3 decades. The specific operational challenge of contesting the strait against a determined Iranian coastal defense has been the central problem of American Middle East naval planning since at least the tanker war of the 1980s. And for most of that period, the honest assessment inside American military planning circles was that the problem was manageable but not eliminable. You could operate in the strait. You could protect specific vessels. You could degrade Iranian capability periodically. But you could not permanently remove Iran's ability to make the strait costly. The geography and the redundancy and the political cost imposition logic made permanent removal beyond what the available tools could achieve at acceptable cost. What changed is not American will or American intelligence or American diplomatic positioning, though all of those have changed. What changed is American capability at the specific technical level where the strait's military geometry is determined. And the change did not happen in one deployment or one strike package or one operational decision. It happened through a sequence of capability deployments and operational actions that each addressed a specific layer of Iran's strait control architecture, until the layers were gone and the architecture they supported had nothing left to stand on. The first layer that went was the drone swarm. This is the layer that Iran invested most heavily in over the past decade. because it represented the solution to the cost asymmetry problem that traditional anti-ship missiles and fast attack boats could not fully solve. A Shahed drone at $20,000 against an interceptor missile at $1 to $4 million was mathematics that favored Iran in sustained operations, regardless of how good American point defense systems were. You run the interceptor magazine down through sustained drone waves, and eventually something gets through against a ship that has nothing left to shoot with. The logic was sound. The investment was substantial. The manufacturing capability that Iran built around this logic was genuinely impressive in scale, if not in individual drone sophistication. The Helios directed energy system removed this layer from the strategic equation, not degraded it, removed it. 60 kilowatts of focused energy at the cost of electricity per engagement against a drone that costs $20,000 to manufacture does not produce a new cost mathematics that favors Iran at some reduced ratio. It produces a cost mathematics where Iran's investment in drone manufacturing is strategically worthless against any vessel equipped with the system. The magazine that the drone swarm was designed to exhaust does not exist. Electricity is not a magazine. As long as the ship has power, the engagement capability is unlimited. Iran can manufacture drones indefinitely. Against Helios-equipped vessels, it is manufacturing expensive debris. The IRGC drone doctrine did not just become less effective when Helios was deployed. It became operationally meaningless as a strategy for imposing the kind of sustained costs that the political exhaustion theory required. You cannot exhaust a defending force whose primary drone defense costs electricity. The political exhaustion strategy requires the defender to pay real costs per engagement. Electricity is not a real cost at the operational level that matters for political exhaustion calculations. The second layer that went was the fast attack boat capability. The IRGC's Mosquito fleet, 500 to 1,000 fast attack boats operating from coastal positions and island staging areas, was the physical embodiment of the swarming doctrine that Iran's naval strategy was built around. Individual boats are individually manageable. Coordinated swarms arriving from multiple vectors simultaneously create the engagement geometry complexity that taxes even sophisticated defensive systems by presenting more simultaneous targeting solutions than the system's engagement rate can service before some boats reach weapons release range. The Apache helicopter turned this doctrine into a liability rather than an asset. The AH-64 Apache engages fast attack boats at ranges where the boat's own weapons cannot reach the helicopter. The Hellfire missile is not a close-range system that requires the helicopter to enter the boat's engagement envelope. It fires from outside that envelope. The 30mm M230 chain gun shreds fiberglass hulls at a rate that makes the engagement duration measured in seconds rather than minutes, and the Apache's speed and altitude remove the geographic concealment advantage that makes coastal cave staging effective for boats. A boat emerging from a coastal cave has a brief window between emergence and the engagement geometry becoming unfavorable. The Apache's sensor suite and weapons range collapse that window to near zero. What happened to Iran's fast attack boat capability in the engagements since this conflict began is not a story of individual boats being sunk in individual engagements. It is a story of doctrine invalidation. The specific tactical sequence that made the fast attack boat swarm an operationally coherent concept, coordinated emergence, multi-vector approach, overwhelming the defensive engagement rate through simultaneous contacts, has been demonstrated to fail against the Apache destroyer combination in every engagement where it has been attempted. The boats that executed the approach were destroyed before reaching weapons release range. The boats behind them watched the boats in front go to the bottom, and the ones that chose to scatter did so having accomplished nothing operationally. The ones that did not scatter in time joined the ones in front. Doctrine that consistently fails in execution is not degraded doctrine. It is former doctrine. The IRGC fast attack boat commanders who received orders to execute swarm approaches in the engagements since February 28th and watched their lead elements get destroyed before any operational effect was produced have updated their assessment of the doctrine's viability. The update is not favorable. The third layer that went was the coastal defense architecture, the missile batteries, radar arrays, command nodes, and logistics infrastructure that turned the naturally favorable geography of the northern shore into an integrated weapon system capable of engaging vessels throughout the channel. This is the layer that Iran spent the most money on and the most time building and the most institutional energy defending conceptually. Because the coastal defense architecture was the backup to the drone swarm and the fast attack boat doctrine. If the swarming approaches failed, the shore-based systems provided the firepower to engage vessels that had survived the swarm. The hardened positions, the redundant targeting networks, the command infrastructure coordinating engagement across the channel's breadth, these were the last line of the access denial strategy that was supposed to make American admirals lose sleep. Operation Epic Fury's targeting logic was built specifically around this architecture, not random strikes on whatever was accessible, a systematic deconstruction of the specific nodes, whose elimination would remove not individual components, but entire functional layers of the integrated system. Bandar Abbas, the command headquarters that coordinated naval operations across the Persian Gulf and the Hormuz approaches. Qasem Island's logistics infrastructure, the resupply chain that made sustained forward operations from the island staging area possible. Minab's dispatch coordination center, the operational brain that assigned mission parameters and timing sequences to the fast attack boat groups. Bandar-e-Kamir's eastern control point, the access management node for the eastern approach corridor. 4 targets. 4 nodes. 4 missing pillars in an architecture that does not lean when pillars are removed. It collapses. The targeting logic was not about destroying as much Iranian military equipment as possible. It was about identifying the minimum set of nodes whose simultaneous elimination would make the entire integrated system non-functional rather than degraded. You do not need to destroy every radar array in the network. You need to destroy the command nodes that integrate the radar data into a coherent targeting picture. Individual arrays without integration produce individual data points that cannot be fused into the engagement geometry the system was designed to produce. The coastal defense architecture that Iran spent years and billions of dollars building to make American admirals lose sleep is not degraded, it is deconstructed. The components that survive, the individual radar arrays whose physical structures were not struck, the missile batteries in hardened positions that were not directly targeted, the fast attack boats that remained in their coastal caves, rather than participating in swarm approaches, these components do not constitute a functional integrated system anymore. They are individual military assets without the command infrastructure, logistic support, and coordination architecture that made them collectively dangerous rather than individually manageable. A missile battery without the radar integration that provides its targeting data is not a missile battery in the operational sense. It is a tube pointed at the sky with a warhead on one end. A fast attack boat without the dispatch coordination center that assigns its mission parameters and approach vector is not a component of a swarm. It is a boat with a gun in a coastal cave. The individual components have not been destroyed. The system they were components of no longer functions. Now here's the part of this story that requires the most careful analytical attention, because it is the part that determines whether what has happened in the Strait of Hormuz represents a temporary degradation that Iran can recover from, or a permanent strategic shift that changes the geometry of the strait in ways that outlast this specific conflict. The IRGC cannot rebuild what was destroyed in the timeline that matters for this conflict's resolution. This is the sentence that contains the most strategic weight in the entire operational picture, and it deserves the precision it requires. The physical infrastructure can eventually be rebuilt. Bandar Abbas's command facilities can be reconstructed. New logistics nodes can be established on Qasem Island. Replacement radar arrays can be positioned along the northern shore. Fast attack boats can be manufactured to replace the ones that went to the bottom of the strait. None of this is physically impossible, given sufficient time and resources. But the blockade that has been running since February 28th at $500 million per day is simultaneously destroying the financial capacity to fund that rebuilding and cutting the import channels, through which the components and materials required for rebuilding would need to flow. The precision strike campaign is simultaneously degrading the manufacturing infrastructure that would produce replacement systems domestically. And the directed energy systems and the Apache capability and the integrated defensive architecture that destroyed the first iteration of the coastal defense system are all still deployed and operational and would address a rebuilt version of the same architecture with the same results. You cannot rebuild a system that was defeated by a capability that still exists. To defeat it again, the rebuilding requires the period of construction to be protected from the same capability that defeated the original. The current American force posture does not provide that protection window. The surveillance architecture that tracked the coastal defense system's pre-deployment movements and used those movements as targeting intelligence is still operational. The strike packages that executed against the command nodes and logistics infrastructure are still available and still accurate. The intelligence picture that made the original targeting so precise has not been degraded by the strikes that used it. Iran cannot rebuild the coastal defense architecture under surveillance conditions that would detect the rebuilding in real time and strike the rebuilding before it reaches operational capability. The window that would be required for rebuilding to matter does not exist in the current operational environment. This is the specific sense in which Iran is powerless in the Strait of Hormuz right now. Not that it has no military assets in the region. It has assets. Not that it has no capability to conduct individual harassing actions. It has that capability in reduced form. But the integrated system whose collective effect created the access denial threat that made global energy markets price. Hormuz disruption seriously is not functional and cannot be made functional in the timeline relevant to this conflict's resolution. The global energy market has processed this assessment. The price response to individual Iranian provocations in recent weeks has been notably muted compared to the spike response to the same category of event 6 months ago. The market is not pricing Hormuz risk the way it did before the operational deconstruction of the coastal defense architecture. This is not sentiment. This is the market's aggregate assessment of a changed operational reality. Markets price risk based on the probability and magnitude of adverse outcomes. The probability of Iran successfully executing the kind of sustained strait disruption that the integrated coastal defense architecture was designed to enable has changed in the market's assessment. The price change reflects that changed assessment with the precision that financial markets achieve when they are processing genuine operational intelligence rather than political noise. The IRGC's own internal assessment reflects the same changed reality through a different lens. The Martyr Commander exercise that the organization conducted in the days following the operational deconstruction was not a military exercise, in the sense that exercises are conducted when an institution is preparing to execute the doctrine being rehearsed. It was a loyalty performance. The naming of an exercise after martyred commanders is institutional communication directed inward at the organization's own soldiers and officers, not outward at the adversary. An institution conducting loyalty performances while its operational doctrine is being demonstrated as insufficient in real engagements is an institution processing a gap between its institutional narrative and its operational reality. That gap is psychologically significant and operationally important because the gap produces decision-making under conditions of institutional stress that rational strategic analysis alone does not predict. The IRGC's hardline faction under Ahmad Vahidi has built its institutional identity around the proposition that the Strait architecture makes American power contestable at acceptable Iranian cost. That identity is now disconnected from the operational reality that the architecture no longer functions. Institutions in this position have two choices. They can update the identity to reflect the operational reality, or they can double down on the identity and choose escalations that the operational reality cannot support. The track record of the hardline faction throughout this conflict is not strongly favorable to the updating option. This is the faction that declared agreement far removed from reality while a ceasefire framework was being negotiated. This is the faction that fired anti-ship missiles at American destroyers during that ceasefire. This is the faction that ordered the 6-hour strait closure that cost permanent assets for 6 hours of disruption and produced the targeting intelligence used in the American response that followed. The pattern is escalation in service of institutional identity maintenance rather than rational operational assessment driving strategic decisions. But the escalation options available to the hardline faction are now constrained in ways they were not constrained in earlier phases of the conflict. The drone swarm option is closed by directed energy. The fast attack boat swarm option is closed by Apache capability and the loss of the logistics and coordination infrastructure. The coastal defense architecture that would provide cover for both of these is deconstructed. What remains is the ballistic missile inventory, estimated at approximately 70% of pre-conflict levels with mobile launcher capability that has been degraded but not eliminated, and the possibility of strikes on Gulf state energy infrastructure that would expand the conflict in ways whose consequences the IRGC's current resource-constrained and internally fractured condition is poorly positioned to manage. The ballistic missile option is the one that the Dark Eagle deployment is specifically designed to address. The Dark Eagle, traveling at Mach 17, collapses the time window that mobile launcher doctrine depends on for survivability. A launcher that exits its bunker, fires, and attempts to return to cover in 30 minutes is operating in a threat environment where the response time is measured in minutes, rather than the hours that conventional strike aircraft require. The mobile launcher's survivability calculation changes when the weapon that can destroy it while it is in the open travels fast enough to close the window that mobility was supposed to provide. The Gulf State infrastructure option carries risks that the IRGC Command Council is calculating with greater uncertainty than its public posture suggests. Striking Saudi or UAE energy infrastructure crosses a threshold that transforms the current conflict from a U.S.-Iran bilateral confrontation with regional dimensions into a regional war with the Gulf Cooperation Council as active belligerents. Pakistan's 13,000 troops in Saudi Arabia and its nuclear umbrella commitment to Riyadh under the bilateral security agreement means that striking Saudi infrastructure involves a second nuclear-armed state in the escalation calculation. The IRGC's planning assumptions about this option are being made with less confidence than the institution's public statements indicate. The parliamentary dimension that has been developing in parallel with the operational picture adds a domestic pressure variable to the IRGC's decision calculus that the purely military analysis misses. Iranian parliamentarians who spoke in a closed session this week created a formal institutional record of IRGC failures, constitutional overreach, and economic consequences for the Iranian civilian population that constitute the beginning of a post-war accountability framework. The IRGC is processing the military defeat in the Strait simultaneously with a domestic institutional challenge from within the Iranian state. Both pressure vectors are pointing in the same direction. Both are telling the same story about an institution whose strategic position has become untenable. The civilian population, whose economic suffering the parliamentarians documented, is not a passive variable in this calculation. Food price inflation, medicine shortages, power blackouts, industrial unemployment, the daily lived experience of the blockade's $500 million loss rate hitting the Iranian economy, these are conditions that produce political pressure that accumulates in ways that the IRGC's domestic suppression apparatus can manage for a period, but cannot prevent from eventually reshaping the political environment within which all of the other decisions are being made. The Fordo uranium enrichment facility and the other deeply buried elements of Iran's nuclear infrastructure are now facing the B-21 and GBU-57 combination that makes their depth insufficient protection against a penetrating weapon delivered by a platform the air defense cannot reliably detect. The specific survival guarantee that depth and hard geology was supposed to provide is now a conditional guarantee dependent on the American decision to employ the B-21, a decision that has not yet been made, but that the deployment of the platform signals as available in a way that was not available last month. The complete operational picture in the Strait of Hormuz right now is a picture of an institution that has been stripped of every layer of the access denial architecture it spent 40 years building, and that finds the remaining tools of its military strategy individually inadequate against the defensive and offensive capabilities arrayed against them. Drone swarms stopped by electricity, fast attack boats destroyed before reaching weapons release range, coastal defense architecture deconstructed at the command and logistics layer, ballistic missiles facing hypersonic response times that collapse the mobile launcher survival window, nuclear infrastructure facing penetrating capability delivered by a platform the air defense cannot see. The strait is open, the oil is moving, the tankers that were sitting in the approaches are transiting. The Brent crude price is reflecting a market that has assessed the operational reality and concluded that the integrated threat to Hormuz transit has been removed rather than temporarily suppressed. This is what powerless looks like when it arrives at the end of a 40-year military investment program that was built on the correct understanding of a geographic opportunity and the incorrect assumption that the adversary who would eventually contest that geography would not develop the specific combination of capabilities required to make the geographic advantage strategically irrelevant. The geography did not change. The 21-mile strait is still 21 miles wide. The northern shore still provides the concealment and approach geometry that Iran's doctrine was built to exploit. The islands are still there. The coastal caves are still there. The mountain terrain that makes overland approaches to shore battery positions difficult is still there. What changed is that none of the geography matters anymore without the integrated system that turned it into a weapons platform. And that integrated system is gone, not weakened. Gone. The components exist in fragments. The system does not exist in function. And the capability to rebuild it under current operational conditions does not exist in the timeline that this conflict's resolution will be determined. Iran spent 40 years building a trap. America walked through it, took it apart piece by piece with a precision and patience that the trap's architects did not model in their planning, and the trap no longer traps anything. The strait is open. Iran is powerless in it, and the decision about what comes next belongs to an institution that built its entire strategic identity around the trap that no longer exists. Drop a comment right now and tell us which part of this story hit you hardest. Was it the directed energy closing the drone swarm option permanently? Was it the targeting logic that deconstructed the coastal defense architecture at the command layer rather than the component layer? Was it the market's price response telling you more about the operational reality than any military briefing? Tell us below. And share this with someone who thinks Iran still has leverage in the Strait of Hormuz, because the leverage was the architecture, and the architecture is gone. The strait is open, and Iran just became powerless in the waterway it spent 40 years trying to control.